The boardroom's air was crisp with artificial confidence, the kind that executives wear like expensive suits. I had been summoned to present the quarterly systems report, a routine task I had completed for years. My life revolved around that infrastructure, the servers I nurtured, the networks I secured, the cyber defenses I patched before anyone even realized a threat existed. I arrived prepared, charts aligned, data verified, the usual arsenal of facts that executives pretended to understand. Yet, something felt different. The CEO leaned back with the smugness of a man convinced he owned reality. His eyes narrowed at me, not with concern, but calculation. He flipped through the slides lazily, barely acknowledging the backbone that kept his empire functional. When he reached the section about the cyber attack I had mitigated months prior, a breach that could have cost millions and crippled operations, he paused. I expected acknowledgement. Instead, he chuckled. That chuckle spread around the table like an infection. He said he saved the company money by refusing to pay unnecessary loyalty bonuses. The room erupted in laughter, as if loyalty, expertise, and heroism were theater props. My bonus wasn't a token gesture. It was negotiated, approved, documented in writing, tied directly to performance metrics that I had exceeded. I stayed in the server room for 72 hours during that breach, sleeping on the floor, rerouting traffic manually, rewriting firewalls in real time while the rest of the company slept comfortably, unaware of the digital wolves clawing at our doors. That bonus represented respect, compensation, recognition. Instead, the CEO had turned it into a joke. He pointed at me as if I were a child who misunderstood adult logic. This is how efficiency looks, he boasted to the investors. We reward results, not expectations. Yet the very results he showcased in his glossy presentations were built on architectures I designed, patch by patch, update after update, late night after late night. I listened motionless as a director whispered that loyalty was outdated, that IT was replaceable. Replaceable. They reduced years of mastery to an invoice they refused to settle. I scanned the room. Every laugh had a face. The CFO with his polished arrogance. The COO who once requested emergency access for a personal device infected with malware. The investors nodding as though they understood any of the acronyms that protected their fortunes. Each smirk carved itself into my memory like a digital imprint. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. People mistake silence for weakness because they don't understand depth. Sharks don't thrash. They glide. My humiliation was not the sting of insult. It was the realization of how disposable competence becomes when ignorance gains a microphone. They forgot who built their digital skeleton, who documented every access, every credential, every emergency override. They forgot that power doesn't always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes, it sits in the one person who understands which cables lead where. As I packed my laptop, I noticed something the others never grasped. Every system had dependencies, every user had privileges, and every door had a lock. They believed they controlled me because they controlled my paycheck. They assumed withholding what they owed would teach me a lesson. They didn't understand the real equation. When you insult the architect of your digital kingdom, you don't embarrass him. You give him motive. You give him clarity. You give him time. And in a world run by systems, motive, clarity, and time are weapons. They laughed at my unpaid bonus. They didn't realize I was already holding the keys to theirs. The CEO believed technology was interchangeable, that IT knowledge was a stack of manuals any engineer could skim through and master in a few weeks. He convinced himself that systems maintained themselves, that passwords were mere characters on a page, and that networks behaved like obedient pets. What he didn't understand was simple. I hadn't just managed the infrastructure. I had created it. Every wire, every script, every contingency plan existed because I built it to survive threats he didn't even know existed. While he bragged about cutting costs, he was severing the very nerve system that kept his empire alive. When I joined the company 9 years earlier, its digital environment resembled a neglected scrapyard. Outdated routers, unpatched servers, expired certificates, an accident waiting for an opportunistic hacker. I redesigned everything from the ground up. I didn't inherit a system, I forged one. I wrote custom authentication rules the software didn't originally allow. I built layered firewalls, encryption pathways, and backup cycles that could run independently in a crisis. No template existed. I innovated where others guessed. What outsiders saw as a technical ecosystem was, in reality, a living organism engineered with a precision no manual could replicate. Each executive loved boasting about digital security, yet none of them realized security wasn't a product. It was a craft. My rules and configurations weren't standardized. They were personal, logical fingerprints designed to prevent disasters. The passwords they used to log into their dashboards? Those credentials were part of a hidden structure, keys that only worked because I wrote the locks myself. They assumed IT work was just typing commands. They never grasped that I had interconnected every subsystem like veins in a body. Remove me and the body doesn't bleed, it collapses. The CEO hired a junior engineer after the meeting, probably believing enthusiasm could replace experience. The poor guy stared at the terminal like a man reading a foreign language. He didn't know which scripts activated daily backups or which log files signaled an attack. He didn't know that the mail server depended on a private authentication loop I built to stop phishing attempts. He didn't know how to interpret the intrusion alerts that appeared harmless to untrained eyes. To him, the system wasn't complex, it was incomprehensible. Meanwhile, executives continued parading around as visionaries. They congratulated themselves for saving money by refusing my bonus, convinced no one was irreplaceable. But systems don't care about ego. They obey rules, and those rules obeyed me. When software updates rolled out, nobody knew how to adapt the configuration without breaking communication channels. When a vendor requested authentication access, the engineers couldn't locate the protocol. When a third-party auditor asked for architecture diagrams, the department stared at each other, because the architecture wasn't documented anywhere except my mind. My silence became their ticking clock. Each ignored email, each delayed request, each malfunctioning tool widened the cracks I had spent years sealing. They thought denying compensation punished me. In truth, they punished themselves. They removed the single person who understood how all the invisible gears turned. They had severed the only bridge connecting their past success to future stability. I watched from a distance as confusion bred panic. Department heads opened support tickets they couldn't decipher. Executives demanded answers no one could give. The CEO, who once laughed at loyalty, now faced a digital fortress without a map. He believed IT was plug and play. He never realized he was plugged into me. And when the person holding the blueprint walks away, the building doesn't burn, it forgets how to stand. Payroll day used to be uneventful. Numbers appeared, accounts updated, and life continued without ceremony. But that morning, my phone stayed silent. No message, no deposit, no confirmation. At first, I assumed there was a system glitch, ironic, considering I was the person who usually fixed such issues. I logged into the payroll portal and saw the truth. My name wasn't missing by accident. It was removed. Deliberately. As though 9 years of service had evaporated overnight. I walked to HR, expecting a clerical correction, maybe even a moment of professional regret. Instead, the department head offered a rehearsed apology, the kind delivered by someone who had been told not to ask questions. He shrugged, saying he had no authority to override the decision. His tone had the flatness of someone who knew a storm was coming, but pretended to enjoy the weather. I asked when the issue would be resolved. He replied, "The CEO handles exceptions." That word, exceptions, landed like a slap. My work had been essential for nearly a decade, yet my salary now relied on someone's spiteful discretion. I found the CEO in his office, leaning back as if the world answered to his posture. He didn't invite me to sit. He didn't look at my report. He smiled like a man who believed he had already won. I explained the situation calmly, requesting my due salary. He tapped his fingers on the table, enjoying the silence before delivering the punchline. "If you want to eat like management," he said, "you should act like management." He laughed as if withholding payment was a leadership lesson. His smirk wasn't motivational, it was predatory. Something shifted inside me, but not the way he imagined. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel humiliation. I felt logic crystallize into certainty. They had reduced my contribution to zero, yet my access governed everything they depended on. If my value meant nothing to them, then my access meant everything to me. Their mistake wasn't denial, it was underestimation. They believed control lived in titles. They forgot control lives in systems. I left without raising my voice. My silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. On my way back to the server room, I noticed details most people ignore: passwords written on sticky notes, unlocked terminals, executives connecting personal devices to the corporate network, layers of negligence waiting for consequences. They behaved as though the infrastructure was automated, as if cables and code owed them allegiance. But loyalty isn't programmed. It's earned. At my desk, I executed a series of checks. Access logs confirmed what I already suspected. Nobody had attempted to understand the architecture since I built it. They had grown comfortable walking across a digital bridge without examining the ropes holding it together. I realized the company didn't fear losing me. They feared realizing what losing me meant. I didn't plan revenge. I planned accuracy. Systems respond to logic, not ego. Over the next hour, the company continued its routine emails, reports, calls, presentations. Nobody sensed the fault lines beneath them. The CEO strutted across the building like a monarch, unaware his throne rested on a server I configured, a password only I understood, and safeguards that required me to breathe life into them. He believed power was financial. He never realized power was operational. Something had broken, not in my emotions, but in my professional contract. They had violated the foundation of every working relationship: reciprocity. Once that collapsed, the consequences weren't personal. They were structural. He thought he denied me a meal. He didn't know he had denied himself a kingdom. And kingdoms don't collapse from enemies. They collapse when the architect stops holding the walls in place. That night, the building was silent, but the network was wide awake. I sat at my desk at home, the glow of my monitor painting the room in cold blue tones. My hands hovered briefly above the keyboard, not from hesitation, but from precision. When power shifts, it shouldn't be noisy. It should be surgical. I entered the master console, the digital throne room of the entire organization. Only 2 people had theoretical access to this interface: the CTO, who had resigned years earlier, and me, the person who created the protocols in the first place. I typed the first command. No alarms rang. No warnings appeared. The system recognized me instantly. Within minutes, the architecture bent under my instructions. Server dependencies paused, one after another, like cities losing power across a dark map. The payroll node went offline first, not out of spite, but symmetry. Then the main authentication server entered maintenance mode. Without it, applications couldn't verify user identities. Cloud backups detached from the network, rendering disaster recovery plans useless. The company's most celebrated digital fortress became a labyrinth with no doors. Inside the headquarters, night shift staff tried to log into their dashboards. They refreshed, rebooted, re-entered passwords. Each attempt failed. The internal communication system crashed next, causing emails to bounce and notifications to loop endlessly. By midnight, the helpdesk ticketing platform displayed a blinking red banner: access denied, system restricted by root administrator. None of them understood what that meant. I did. It meant the company was bleeding out, and no one knew where the wound was. Production servers followed. Automated orders stalled, inventory froze, and scheduled tasks halted mid-execution. It was a digital cardiac arrest. The factory machines still hummed, unaware they were now isolated metallic islands with no command center. The lockdown didn't damage anything. It simply disconnected everything they took for granted. I didn't destroy the infrastructure. I silenced it. And silence terrifies those who mistake noise for control. By dawn, the CEO walked into chaos disguised as routine. He sat at his desk, pressed the power button on his computer, and waited. The loading icon spun, then stopped. He tried again. Nothing. He called IT support. They couldn't log in. He tried accessing emails. They bounced. He attempted to run analytics dashboards for the morning briefing. Every system responded with the same message: credential required, root access only. Executives gathered in the boardroom, staring at screens that displayed error messages like tombstones. The CFO speculated it was an external attack. The COO blamed the junior engineer. Someone suggested calling the software vendor, unaware that every vendor connection passed through authentication rules I had customized. The CEO paced like a trapped animal, his confidence dissolving. Expensive furniture surrounded him, but none of it could execute a single command. His empire, stripped of its digital bloodstream, resembled a luxury hotel after the generators fail, beautiful, useless, and humiliating. They kept asking the same question: who has access to fix this? Each time, silence answered. They forgot systems don't break at random. They are either maintained or abandoned. And they had abandoned the only person who knew how the wires connected, the scripts executed, and the safeguards unlocked. I didn't feel joy. I felt inevitability. When a structure is built by one mind and dismissed by another, collapse isn't revenge, it's mathematics. All I did was withdraw myself from the equation, and the company revealed its true dependence. Power isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It waits patiently behind passwords no one else understands. They fired loyalty. They overlooked architecture. They discovered that night what every kingdom learns too late: a throne without a foundation isn't a seat. It's an accident waiting for gravity. The summons came before sunrise. An email marked urgent report immediately landed in my inbox, followed by 3 missed calls from numbers I once recognized as familiar extensions. The same executives who had spent months treating me like a background utility now sounded like firefighters trapped inside a burning building. I didn't rush. Panic belongs to those who don't understand systems. I arrived at the office at my own pace, walked through the glass doors, and observed something new: silence. Not the kind born from focus, but the kind born from fear. The boardroom looked different. Chairs were missing, moved hastily to other rooms where frantic discussions had devolved into arguments. Screens flickered, frozen mid-air, a visual reminder that nothing inside those walls obeyed the people who believed they ran the company. The CEO stood at the table, not behind it, his posture slumped, his tone stripped of sarcasm. His eyes darted around, searching for confidence that wasn't there. He didn't greet me. He pleaded. "What happened?" he asked, voice trembling like a man speaking through cracked glass. Gone was the charming smirk he used as a shield. Gone was the arrogance that had once fueled his boasts. He looked smaller, not physically, but structurally, like a building missing pillars. I didn't answer immediately. I let the room breathe its discomfort. Every executive avoided eye contact, as if guilt were contagious. The CFO pushed a stack of papers across the table, printed spreadsheets, their desperate attempt to understand the crisis using tools that no longer connected to anything. Those sheets were now nothing more than dead trees. The CEO tried again, softer this time. "We need you to restore the systems." I spoke slowly, each word deliberate. Systems don't run on arrogance. They run on respect. The sentence didn't come from anger. It came from observation. For years, I watched them treat infrastructure like decoration. They adored results yet despised the hands that produced them. They believed intelligence was a cost to minimize, not a strength to cultivate. Now, stripped of the digital power I had silently maintained, they stood exposed, executives without execution. The CEO stuttered excuses: miscommunication, misunderstanding, unfortunate timing. The board nodded aggressively, as if synchronized regret could reverse consequences. They spoke about teamwork, loyalty, the shared mission of the company. It was almost poetic. People who dismissed me were now rewriting history to include me as its cornerstone. I didn't interrupt. Silence is a powerful negotiator. Their words evaporated into it. They begged for explanations that required knowledge they never respected. Someone asked why the junior engineer couldn't resolve the issue. Another whispered whether backups still existed. Their voices overlapped like children searching for a misplaced key. Then something remarkable happened. The CEO's mask cracked. His voice rose, then broke. He slammed his palm on the table, not out of strength, but panic. He admitted the investors were furious, the clients were calling, production contracts were on hold, and the company's reputation had become a question mark. He leaned in, almost whispering, "We can't function without you." Those 6 words, the truth they had buried under pride, hung in the air like smoke. I looked at the faces around the table. People who once laughed now stared at me as if I were oxygen. Their fear wasn't of me, it was of irrelevance, realizing titles mean nothing without competence standing behind them. I offered no speeches, no accusations, no demands. I simply said nothing. The board interpreted my silence more clearly than any sentence. They realized humiliation has a price. They realized replacing respect with ego creates a debt systems will collect. They realized the person they dismissed understood not just how things worked, but why they worked. In that chairless room, they learned the first real principle of power. A company isn't built by who talks the loudest. It's built by the one who knows which buttons to press when everyone else forgets where they are. The moment they realized I wasn't there to rescue them out of nostalgia, the tone of the room shifted. Their earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by desperation thick enough to taste. The CEO cleared his throat, trying to regain authority, but authority is not a costume. Once removed, it doesn't fit again. He leaned forward, voice unsteady, and asked for the root credentials, the master keys that could bring the system back online. It was almost comical. They had treated me as replaceable and now pleaded for access as if asking for oxygen. I didn't rush my answer. People in panic hear only the truth that affects them. I didn't ask for apologies or speeches about misunderstandings. Words don't restore trust, consequences do. So I asked for numbers. Real numbers. My unpaid bonus, multiplied by 5. Not because I needed the money, but because value must be recalibrated when someone attempts to reduce it. The CFO's face drained of color, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as though stability might return through friction. He sputtered something about budgets and fiscal alignment. I watched him struggle to articulate resistance before swallowing it whole. Survival teaches humility brutally. Next, I presented the second part of the price, a consulting retainer. Not a salary. Not an employment offer. A retainer large enough to ensure that every login they initiated, every update they requested, and every digital breath the company took required acknowledgement of the person who built the system. Executives exchanged glances like prisoners deciding who would break first. Their pride had caged them, and now they negotiated freedom using currency they once refused to spare. The board didn't debate. They didn't bargain. They didn't ask for justification. They voted. Unanimously. Their signatures hit the contract faster than my bonus request had been denied. This wasn't generosity, it was triage. Without access, they didn't have operations. Without operations, they didn't have clients. Without clients, they didn't have a company. I wasn't asking for compensation, I was selling oxygen in a burning building. As legal formalities progressed, their fear morphed into reverence. Eyes that once rolled at my presentations now tracked my movements as if I were handling explosive material. The CEO tried to salvage dignity by calling it a strategic partnership, a phrase he repeated enough times to convince himself it was true. But the truth sat plainly between us. The company was no longer operating with me, it was existing because of me. The CFO signed last. His hand trembled, the ink smearing slightly as he wrote. To him, this wasn't a contract. It was a confession. He had underestimated a quiet man who understood systems better than politics. He thought money was leverage. He didn't realize access was currency. When he slid the signed papers toward me, I didn't smile. Victory isn't loud. It doesn't pose. It recognizes inevitability. Once the deal was complete, I restored access. Systems booted up slowly, like a comatose patient learning to breathe again. Alerts cleared. Authentication resumed. Emails synchronized. Production dashboards flickered back to life. Executives sighed with relief, their bodies relaxing for the first time in days. They believed they had regained power. They hadn't. They had only rented it. Because here's what they finally learned. Access isn't just technical, it is authority. A locked door is a statement. A key is a crown. They owned the building, but I owned the ability to turn it on. They paid the price not because they valued me, but because they finally understood the cost of ignoring the person who controls the gates. And some gates don't reopen unless you learn how expensive disrespect can become. Restoring the systems wasn't a switch I flipped. It was a process, a deliberate, methodical resurrection that forced the company to witness every layer they had taken for granted. I didn't rush. I didn't sprint. I worked at a pace that allowed the board to understand something they had ignored for years. Infrastructure isn't magic, and expertise isn't a commodity you replace because it feels convenient. The servers returned one heartbeat at a time, their logs illuminating screens like the pulse of a patient waking from a coma. The first day, I reconnected authentication protocols. The company's executives, who once smirked at the invisible labor behind their dashboards, now hovered behind me like anxious relatives in an intensive care unit. Every time a system beeped to life, someone exhaled. They watched commands scroll like scripture, realizing these lines of code were the skeleton they had mocked. Their panic simmered into awe, and awe softened into silence. The second day, I rebuilt access hierarchies. I removed obsolete accounts, revoked unauthorized privileges, and instituted multi-layer encryption they didn't know was possible. Their junior engineer, once hailed as my replacement, sat beside me taking notes so fast his wrist cramped. He wasn't incompetent, he was unprepared. No one had explained that IT isn't a department. It's a nervous system, and tampering with it without understanding can paralyze the body it supports. On the third day, I documented everything. Not summaries, not shortcuts. Complete blueprints, maps of architecture, dependencies, emergency failovers, and procedures for internal disasters. For 9 years, they had relied on my brain as their safety net. Now, I was transferring that net into a structure anyone competent could maintain. They watched me write the manual they always assumed existed. Their eyes widened when they realized how much knowledge had lived solely in one mind. Power, I learned, is not in possession. It's in awareness of who possesses it. Then came training. I spent hours with the new team, not to show superiority, but to demonstrate responsibility. We ran simulations. We triggered controlled failures. I guided them through rollback sequences, taught them how to interpret logs, and explained the logic behind my decisions. They expected shortcuts. I offered systems thinking. When one engineer asked why I added so many layers of redundancy, I answered simply, because companies collapse faster than they admit mistakes. The board watched everything. They had no jokes left. The CEO, once theatrical with arrogance, now stood quietly in the corner. His smile was gone not from anger, but from realization. He finally understood the difference between confidence and competence. He had mistaken visibility for value. Now he saw value in the places he couldn't see. On my final day, I restored the last server of a legacy machine tied to financial operations. When it hummed back into life, the CFO clapped involuntarily. The CEO extended his hand. His smile was different now, not triumphant, but humbled. It belonged to someone who had finally counted the cost of ego and discovered the invoice was written in consequences. "You've given us more than systems," he said. "You've given us structure." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Meaning lives in results, not speeches. I packed my things slowly, leaving behind a digital world more stable than the one I inherited. The security team escorted me to the lobby, not as a formality, but as a salute. The receptionist, who once barely acknowledged me, stood to shake my hand. When I walked out, they didn't lose an employee. They lost their dependency. And sometimes, the end of dependence is more terrifying than the end of employment, because now they knew the truth. A company doesn't collapse when talent leaves. It collapses when it realizes talent was the foundation all along. Months slipped by, yet echoes of the lockdown lingered like a ghost the building refused to exorcise. At first, the company tried pretending nothing had happened. Press releases spoke of routine maintenance, executives blamed a vendor miscommunication, and HR distributed a forced smile to anyone who asked questions. But buildings have memories and employees have better ones. In every corridor, in whispered conversations beside the coffee machine, my name surfaced, not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that respect isn't optional. Then came the day the CEO addressed the entire organization in the auditorium, a place usually reserved for celebrations or strategic announcements. He strode onto the stage with the stiffness of a man carrying a burden he never expected to lift. Behind him, a screen displayed a new initiative, Loyalty Incentive Program, performance bonuses guaranteed by contract. The words glowed with corporate enthusiasm, but everyone understood the truth. They were not incentives. They were apologies disguised as progress. He spoke of reform, of recognizing contributions, of ensuring that loyalty is not only appreciated but rewarded. Every sentence trembled with irony. The man who once laughed at unpaid bonuses now stood as their most vocal advocate. It wasn't leadership. It was self-preservation. Investors had questioned the leadership culture. Clients asked pointedly who maintained their systems now. The board demanded assurance that such a disaster could never repeat. The CEO did not change his principles, his circumstances changed his posture. Employees exchanged glances. Some raised their eyebrows. A few chuckled quietly. Everyone knew the origin story behind these protocols. My departure wasn't a resignation. It was a reckoning. They had treated a foundational role like a replaceable part. Systems taught them otherwise. Where speeches failed, consequences educated. The onboarding department rewrote orientation materials. New hires listened to a softened version of the legend, a brilliant IT head whose departure froze the company in its tracks until leadership learned humility the expensive way. Some details were embellished. Some softened. All carried the same immutable truth: never underestimate the quiet one who understands the machine. The bonus they refused to pay became the most expensive non-payment in corporate history. Investors asked about continuity plans during board reviews. Auditors demanded technical documentation before approving renewals. Departments that once dismissed IT now sent daily check-ins, terrified of another blackout. The culture shifted not toward fear, but toward awareness. Respect became a line item, not an afterthought. Meanwhile, I had moved on. Other companies sought me out, not with shallow promises, but with agreements respecting expertise. The consulting retainer from my previous employer arrived every 30 days like clockwork, a silent reminder of what arrogance can cost. I never needed to brag. Their payments were my billboard. Word of my work spread across the industry, not because I marketed myself, but because they unknowingly did it for me. Clients asked a single question before signing contracts: is your system documented, or is it dependent on one person? Then someone would mention my name, and the conversation changed. What had once been dismissed as a luxury now became a non-negotiable standard. Back at my former company, the CEO's eyes carried a different expression during public appearances, not confidence, but caution. He had learned that kingdoms fall not because of enemies storming the gates, but because the architects stop reinforcing them. He never thanked me publicly. He didn't need to. His policies were acknowledgments carved into company culture. The story lives on. In training manuals, in risk assessments, in onboarding briefings. The lesson is simple and eternal. You can delay a bonus. You can deny recognition. But when the person who built the digital kingdom walks away, the walls don't crack. They remember who held them together. They mocked the architect. They forgot King's Fall. Architects rebuild elsewhere. And some lessons cost more than money. They cost ignorance its throne.